Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Humanity Now. Today, we are starting our podcast series on People's Assembly. Here at Humanity Now, you know we advocate for direct democracy, everyone having a direct say in everything that affects their lives, family, and community. How do we make that happen in our communities? How can we design a new society where everyone's needs are met and their voices are heard? We think people assemblies are a solution to these problems, and that is what we will be exploring in this series. The series' first guest is Mason Herson-Hord. He is a longtime activist and community organizer from Detroit. He organizes there and is also a board member and director for the Institute for Social Ecology. Welcome, Mason, to Humanity Now podcast. Can you please tell the audience a bit more about yourself?
Sure. And thanks for having me. So my name's Mason. I'm the program director for the Institute for Social Ecology, which is a popular education organization doing educational work for people in social movements to, um, help give some intellectual clarity to our movement building and organizing projects. And um, it's also part of the group that formed what is now the Symbiosis Federation, a network of grassroots revolutionary organizations building dual power through direct democracy and solidarity economy on the local level all across North America. And that's been a really interesting and helpful way to learn more about how different groups are extending practices of assembly democracy and direct participation in political decision making in different contexts all across the US and Canada and Mexico.
That's great. Thank you. Let's get started. The first question I have is, what is direct democracy?
So I think when most people hear the word democracy, at least today, our assumptions are this refers to some kind of representative system where we elect people to make decisions on our behalf. And I think it's fairly clear from the experience of parliamentary or representative democratic systems, especially um, in the capitalist world, that um, these are incapable of translating popular opinion into public policy because they're this select group of decision makers is really subject to political capture by ruling class interests. And so the idea of direct democracy is that instead of handing off power to a small group of representatives to make decisions for us, we develop institutions for decision making where we ourselves are the decision makers. And I think there's a number of different elements to a robust understanding of direct democracy. Um, the so some of these that social ecologists emphasize are that this kind of direct democracy needs to be deliberative, as in cultivating spaces of discussion where the people as a whole can come together, influence one another's um, views on key questions, rather than just tallying up everyone's pre-existing views, um, as might happen like a referendum, um, which is a sort of a seed of direct democratic practice within at least some representative systems. There's also, I think it's also important to um, broaden our conception of where democracy belongs well beyond the things that we normally think of as the business of government or politics, and expanded outwards into the economy, into management of ecosystems. I mean, most people's economic lives are essentially living under a dictatorship by their bosses, where all the decisions that affect them, are made by someone else. And an expansive, radical view of direct democracy entails democratizing all of those spaces as well, so that ordinary people have a direct say in what's going on around them. And the last general point I would say about what direct democracy is that for many kinds of decision making, the scale at which the decision is being made or needs to be made is beyond the immediate local level, where people can come together face to face to make decisions. And so we need to develop mechanisms for making decisions across those local assemblies in a way that still retains power at the base. And so social ecologists will talk about this. This is a distinction between representation, where we're handing power to a representative who possesses independent decision-making authority, and delegation, where these assemblies may send a delegate, but to some other body of delegates to work things out, but they don't have independent decision-making power, because the assembly has come to a collective position, and delegates function more as mouthpieces for their assemblies. And this can be enforced through procedures like direct recall, through things called like an imperative mandate, that kind of ensure that people who represent us at higher level decision making aren't able to do so independently, and that they're forced to only be speakers for decisions that have already been made.
Very good. Thank you. You make some good points there. My next question, you kind of already answered it. What is a People's Assembly meeting like? Or, how can we implement this in our communities?
So what People's Assemblies are like varies dramatically across cultural contexts. It really depends on who your community is, and what kind of circumstances you're dealing with. In my experience with assembly organizing, I found that it's much more straightforward to begin these kinds of spaces of community discussion with a focus on a particular issue that concerns everyone in the neighborhood. So, for example, in my own context in Detroit, our neighborhood group, which in Detroit are known as block clubs, first took up the issue of illegal dumping, because contractors in the suburbs would drive into our neighborhood and dump a bunch of construction waste on vacant lots and so forth. And we weren't talking about how are we going to build a participatory, genuinely democratic political system that can overthrow capitalism in the state. We got together to talk about how are we going to respond to this immediate, concrete, material problem that affects all of us, and that also, there are obvious ways in which all of us coming together to deal with it can address it. And once you kind of have people in the room to respond to these sorts of immediate needs, I think you are situated to kind of build and strengthen a vehicle for all kinds of future collective action that can refocus itself on different issues, on different problems, where the community is going to need to make decisions together. And um, coordinate some kind of collective response. And so that's kind of where we went with things was um, began um, taking over vacant properties to turn into community gardens, mobilized resistance to some industrial redevelopment plans from the city, um, for bringing in polluting industries into our neighborhood. Um, and I think many of the most successful examples of durable People's Assembly type institutions that I'm familiar with, um, they rely on having the consistent participation of people who are outside of left-wing activist milieus or subcultures, who have lots of stuff going on in their lives with kids and work and needing to pay rent and everything else. And so to have the kinds of mass participation that is required of them to even be a people's assembly, um, they need to be addressing direct, concrete problems that, which is like it's clear to people that their participation matters and makes a difference in their own lives. And I think once there's more experience of what it's like to make decisions collectively and deliberatively, that can also kind of open people's political imagination about what other things that we could take on, increase our sort of confidence in ourselves as um, capable of governing our own community, and from there, sky's the limit.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to ask you some of the nuts and bolts details about how you've experienced People's Assembly meetings. What are some of the details of the procedures you've used to make sure that everybody's voice is heard? And also, what is consensus building?
hmm so again, this is one that varies wildly across contexts. I've been in assemblies that have used totally different procedures, some of which I think have worked really well, others of which I don't think work terribly well, but um, we are all kind of learning as we go. For procedures that ensure that um, everyone's voice gets heard, I think one of the most important one is the principle of rotation. There are roles that are necessary and take greater commitment from someone to be carried out properly. Things like facilitation, doing, um, like mobilization turnout stuff, getting people to actually show up and knocking on doors and so forth, um, note taking, and um, those are the kind of roles that can sort of um, calcify an organization and give it sort of um, a functionally top-down structure where there are the people who are running the meeting and the people who are deciding to show up. And these are difficult problems to work through, especially with there's like a small group who's really committed to making this happen, and many of the other people in the community participating don't have as much time. But I think making a commitment to regularly rotating people out of those positions is a really essential uh, procedural mechanism for trying to resist that tendency. Um, when it comes to running the meetings themselves, the most effective assemblies that I've been a part of have um, tried, at least for most of the meeting, to follow a process known as a round, where instead of people being called on by a facilitator to speak or just jumping in. We all sit in a circle together, and um, one person speaks at a time, going in a circle around the room. And if you don't have anything to say at that time, you can always pass. But the space is specifically held for each of the individual person to speak every time it goes around, and that that ends up bringing lots of voices in that otherwise probably would not be interjecting to speak. It also forces people to think more and reflect more about what they're going to say. And there's less back and forth discussion that's able to happen. And, sometimes it means that something you wanted to say initially gets passed by because, the conversation has moved on or something. But personally, I think that's kind of enhanced the quality of the deliberations that people have and ensure that it's a more participatory meeting where everyone is on equal footing um, in a way that can otherwise be sort of dominated by a few outgoing or charismatic voices. Um, as far as how decisions are made, there's been a long-standing debate among advocates of people's assemblies between um, whether or not to deploy consensus decision making or majority rule. Um, and I've been part of both. I personally think that hybrid models tend to be the most effective, where you your first attempt for any decision is to go through a consensus process, which means um, having every person um, voice any misgivings or opposition they have to a given proposal, and and then trying to integrate their objections into what the proposal is to make it more amenable to everybody. And I think that kind of process um, almost always results in better decisions being made, and ones that have deeper buy-in from the people participating in um, in the discussion, and that kind of sense of ownership of decisions being made is really crucial for assemblies in particular, because we're not just making a decision to hand off to somebody else to do. um, we're going to be the ones to have to carry it out. We're just deciding what we're going to do together, and um, there's lots of groups that kind of make decisions and can steamroll things through, um, but then it doesn't go anywhere because um, there's not a sense of uh, commitment by the people in that process to actually seeing it through. And I think that those are some of the practical values of consensus. The shortcomings, of course, is that oftentimes a um, full agreement is not actually possible. We have, especially in contexts where not everyone is of the same politics. Um, we all of your neighbors together are not going to have the same views on everything, and sometimes we have like genuinely irreconcilable differences in opinion about direction of things, um, and so that can be a real stumbling block for consensus processes, which have mostly been developed for political contexts where everyone more or less shares the same goals, values, and core political ideas. And so I think it's important to maintain um, recourse to a vote should you be unable to come to some kind of full consensual opinion for the whole group. And so I've and been a part of a number of groups that have experimented with different forms of, strive for consensus, vote at the end um, if there's not a clear pathway to resolving it. Um, some people, have that doesn't answer all the questions. Like there's some people who have want to move things more towards having majority rule become earlier in that process. Others think it's more important to spend more time trying to um, reach consensus. And I think ultimately that's kind of a question that just needs to be figured out by each community that's trying to do people's assemblies. And it's something that we learn to do well by doing it badly, and then doing it again. And these are all skills that most of us have no prior experience exercising, and reading about democracy in books is not a very good teacher of democracy itself. Um, and so I think that'll be a long term, educational project for ourselves, of building up those democratic muscles that our current society is mostly leaving to atrophy. Um, Other procedures that are useful. Um, yeah, I think those are the most important ones in my opinion. Having ways that clearly um, delineate like what decisions have been made after the fact, and making those available to people who weren't present is important, both for including people who miss, or keeping people up to date who miss assembly meetings, but also to kind of maintaining some continuity of the assembly as an institution, kind of holding ourselves to what we've committed to as far as projects and so forth. Um, that's been something that like more starting up assembly groups that I've been a part of have struggled with. It's like we said we're going to do one thing 1 month, and then it kind of is. Uh, it's not necessarily clear that that's going to get carried out, or decisions made previously get rehashed again, and a lot of making this worthwhile for people is keeping these kinds of things efficient and effective, and having clear, straightforward processes of um, transitioning what we say we want into concrete action. And those are things that take practice to figure out.
Right. Okay. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about how local people's assemblies can be scaled up to the regional and global decision making. You touched on it earlier, but mentioning delegates. How do you envision, public assemblies having a regional and global effect on decision making?
So, in my neighborhood, we've been working on a project with a number of other block clubs in the immediate area, where each one sends a couple people to a monthly meeting to talk about stuff. And most of the focus has been on securing community benefits agreements um, from developers or employers that are trying to come into our neighborhood. But it's that effort has kind of facilitated building up a local federation of block clubs that is capable of carrying out decisions as a group for the whole neighborhood. And um, I think there have been um, some fledgling attempts at getting something similar going for our whole city council district. which there's tons of block clubs elsewhere outside of our immediate neighborhood. Um, and what I want that to be shaped as, um, is having institutional links between these kinds of face-to-face community organizations where they are able to send a recallable, rotating delegate to meetings where we both discuss things, make plans, but also bring um, information and ideas and practices back to um, our own immediate group of neighbors. Um, and I think those kinds of institutions of connection and federation between different direct democracy uh, initiatives and assemblies is both a way of deepening and broadening the kind of political power we're able to bring to bear against um, top-down governance, but it's also a way of like enhancing um, the political practices and um, the kinds of ideas that we have about what we could take on um, as a community group by learning from what others are doing. And I think those basic principles um, of federation through recallable delegates is something that's ultimately infinitely scalable, um, even if we want to make sure that we're keeping as much decision making close to home as possible. Um, and so that kind of scaling up is something that Symbiosis is um, attempting to work through or figure out um, for these kinds of different explicitly revolutionary organizations across North America. Um, and I won't say that we have figured it out by any means. I think this is another area where we're trying to make the road by walking it and learn as we go. Um, and a lot of the kinds of decisions that we're able to make at this stage are not, like binding ones that everyone who participates in the process is then forced to do. We're we're functionally doing something that's more akin to coordination of working out what we can best accomplish together, and from there coordinating our activities to carry it out in unison um, and then that's different from being able to impose decisions on groups that have different views and so forth. um, and when it comes to questions of governance that are higher scale, like um, pollution for a given watershed, or coordinating public transportation, or dealing with climate change, things that have to be tackled at a scale beyond the immediate local. I think these kinds of processes of uh, bringing proposals or decisions back to our own communities, having them be refined through further discussion, and the best ideas from our local assemblies being able to work its way up the chain of delegation um, is I think it takes longer than many other forms of political decision making, but it also ensures that the best decisions are actually being made. And I think the other thing I think is important to keep in mind is, like, we can build these institutions up as much as we want, um, but so long as we are subject to forms of top-down state power. In many cases, we're not going to be allowed to carry out the decisions that these kinds of spaces of direct democracy are making it and want to turn into reality. And I think ultimately answering your question of how do we scale this to the global or the regional entails a clash between these kinds of institutions of self-governance that we are seeking to develop and the state. And that's why groups like Symbiosis are articulating what they're doing as developing dual power, that being a counterpower to the state that is able to contest with it for legitimacy, because we will need to be able to displace the state if we want to make direct democracy a governing reality for our own communities and the wider world.
Excellent. This sounds like a lot of meetings. It sounds like a lot of work. Some of my thoughts are that once these people's assemblies are, forming and creating the procedures and and everything to make them happen, that it'll become easier to have them. And all these decisions that we need to make together as a community, some decisions, once they're made, a precedent will be set and will create a new status quo that will allow these to make less meetings, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Is that, to me, there'll be a lot of work and a lot of meetings to begin with, but then, as things, as a new society is created and is implemented, we won't need the people's assemblies as much as we do in the beginning. Does that make sense? What are your thoughts?
I think that you the we need to like pace the meetings on the basis of like what what our capacity is locally rather than what it feels necessary to get done. And that can be kind of a hard thing to learn, especially for organizers just getting started, because it feels like there's so much urgency and we're so far away from our goals, and um, there's so much to figure out and be done. Um, but I think that can be unsustainable, and um, so like our most of our block club groups, they meet one time a month, and then the local like council of all the delegates from different block clubs in the area also meets once a month. And if we don't have time to get through everything, we prioritize, and we kind of go at the pace that we can handle. And I think the other element of this that's really important is um, making those gatherings fulfilling in themselves as well, so that it's not just work for people to be there. So after we built our community garden, during the warmer months, we go and meet there, and people bring bags to pick produce from the garden before or after the meeting starts. Sometimes we'll do a little potluck, um and we'll schedule in like some unstructured, just hanging out and chatting time at the beginning, to turn it kind of into a space where you can see all your neighbors in one place. And um I think I think there's lots of ways we could do that and could have done that more intentionally and more effectively. um, but I do really think that um, expecting people to meet just to meet when they have so many other obligations and so much else going on is an unsustainable prospect, and it will narrow the scope of participation to a committed core, and then you're not left with a people's assembly as a mass organization anymore. Um, and um, and I think those are the keys to, or at least some of them, to making these kinds of institutions durable and able to grow and sustain themselves over the long haul. Um, and there have been phases where we've met really intensely because there were external pressures on us, like we were fighting the city on some development proposals, and um, it was energizing, but it also, um, I think it wore a lot of people out. And um, I my preference after that experience has definitely been for taking it slower, um, and doing what we can on whatever's like reasonable on our own time frame. And we will get there eventually. Um, and we go slow, we'll be able to keep everyone with us.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. My final question, which is a bit broad, but I want to hear your thoughts. How can we use direct democracy to help unite humanity and create a new society by the people for the people?
That is indeed a big question. Um, I would say that one small piece of this that I think is really important, that assembly democracy, the experience of being in, um, has been really impactful on myself and how I see connections to others and what's possible in the world is um, is it kind of like reshapes what we think of as decision making and as power, because most of us experience decisions as either something that we ourselves just decide for our personal lives as individuals, or something that is decided for us by someone who doesn't know anything about our lives. And so we're kind of split between a sort of uh, personal individualism and being subject to the whims of other people. And I think the experience of direct democracy, of participating in assembly type spaces, um, means both kind of laying claim to a power that we've been denied, of we finally get to exercise some power over our own lives through making decisions and actually carrying them out in ways that um, kind of determine what's happening in our immediate surroundings. But they also um, can kind of impose a bit of humility and reduction of the self through um, needing to work with other people to come to those decisions. And I mean, there I've had a number of experiences where there's been some proposal that I thought was really misguided um, or incorrect or what have you, and I'm on the losing end of that discussion, and we do it, and it turns out to be one of the most like um, effective, thoughtful things that we've ever tried. And I think it kind of part of learning democracy um, is being like forced to accept or being like taught to accept the wisdom of the group over um, what your own personal thoughts are at any given moment. Um, and that kind of humility is something that's really hard to learn in a deeply individualistic society. Um, but I think it's a key component of um, building kind of a new human community and a new ways of relating to each other. And I don't think it's something that anyone can learn by being told about it or reading about it or even personally identifying with. Um, it's something that we kind of have to absorb experientially. And I think people's assemblies are one of the most effective ways to help us internalize a new logic of relating to others, and even has a new way of relating to ourselves, um, for creating a totally different future.
Excellent, Mason. Thank you so much for your time. Um, that was very helpful. Can you please tell the audience about how they can follow you and anything that you want to link to for people to do further research?
Sure. So, um, the Institute for Social Ecology's website is social ecology.org, and we offer all kinds of online classes and educational events. We usually hold an in-person week-long intensive course once a year somewhere in North America. Um, so you could be on the lookout for that. We have a round of fall courses that start in a couple weeks that folks should check out. I'll be teaching a class on Marxism and direct democracy. We have a class on social ecology and feminism, a class on the history and philosophy of biology, and then our intro to social ecology course, which should be a great place to start if you're just learning about these ideas. And um, would also encourage people to check out Symbiosis. Um, our website is pretty out of date, and we don't have a lot of active, outward facing web presence. But um, if you head to symbiosis-revolution.org, there's information on how to get connected if you're part of a local group that is working on these kinds of things. Um, that would be the way to connect with us and get looped in on what we're building. Um, you can also follow me on Twitter. My handle's M Herson-Hord. And I would suggest following the ISC as well. We put all of our new classes and info on how to get engaged with what we're doing there on social media too.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mason, for your time. And as always, Humanity Now, we call for uniting humanity, ending supremacy. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks for having me.